So, how did you originally get into art and design?
Okay, it kind of goes back to early life, my childhood. I always wanted to be in the army. I always thought that I would go into the army, and I thought that until I was about 15 or 16. At which point I was at boarding school in England by that point, and I went for I had an interview with Sandhurst, and I got a provisional place depending on my A level results. And then I sort of had a rethink after that in the intervening period, and thought, oh bloody hell, I'm not sure that this is going to be too good, because I mean people shoot at you in the army and stuff like that. I mean you don't just walk around in a smart uniform.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, what else can I do? At this point, I was doing art A level, and I thought, well, my sister had been to St Martin's, and I could draw, and that was about the only other thing I could do really. And I thought, I'm never going to be a lawyer or an accountant or a medic or anything like that. So I better see if I can get into art school. So I applied to St Martin's because my sister had been to St Martin's 9 years earlier, and got a place. So I went and did pre-dip there, and when I left school, and so it went on. That's how I got into it.
How did you find St Martin's, their teaching methods and so on?
Well, it had already gone past its heyday, to be honest. I mean, it had a reputation from an earlier time for illustration, particularly, and by the time I was there, its reputation was shifting into fashion. So it had a very, very good painting department, sculpture department, graphics was pretty good, but it had lost that kind of dominance, if you like, and the dominance was rising, was in the fashion world. So that was my memory of my experience of those 4 years. It was great. I really thought it was a great time. I had my doubts about the teaching staff, the graphics department, but actually there was some pretty good part-time people that came in who were working in professionally, and they came in and did an evening class here and there, or a 1 day a week or something. So I got most of my benefit from those people that one or two gave me some really good support. And I was just jammy that I'd started becoming interested in animation because there was an evening class once a week, which was for film. All you had was 3 hours or something like that a week. But that department had a rostrum camera, it had editing equipment, or audio editing and visual editing, in those days film, and I just got hooked by it. I just thought, I was becoming kind of disillusioned with the mainstream graphics, if you like. It was all seeming a bit ordinary, and I just thought, well, here's another dimension to this. You can add sound and movement to graphics, and that has a grasp. It's something that is intriguing, and so I kind of drifted into that. And coming up to the last summer break before the final year, IBM had a place in Gunnersbury in West London, and they ran an audiovisual department from there. And the guy who ran that came into the St Martin's and said, have you got any students that might be interested in doing a summer working as a placement with our department? So I put my hand up, and another girl put her hand up, and we did 8 weeks in that summer break working for their audiovisual department, which was fantastic. And one of the projects they got me to do while I was there was planning a piece of animation of no more than 10 minutes, so probably about 8 minutes it was intended to be. And they then offered, when I presented that, by the time we were stopping work, they said, how do you feel about making this? And I said, well, hang on a second, I've got my final year coming up, I'm not sure that I could actually do it. And they said, well, look, tell you what, if you can give us the time, We'll pay for all the costs of rostrum camera, editing, all that kind of stuff, processing movies, film. We'll pay for all of that if you put your time in. And so I struggled a bit with the powers that be at the St. Martin's. And I finally convinced them. They said, absolutely no way. There's no way you're going to be able to do our projects as well as they. And I said, well, okay, well, I'll leave then, because your projects, are as fine as they are all hypothetical. And this one's a proper commercial project, So there's no doubt in my head that if I have to choose, I'll leave. So they went, I don't know about, okay, well, we'll tell you what, you can use it as part of your dip show. If you do 25% of our projects, you can do that as 75% of the work. So that's what happened. In the end, I just as we were coming to the dip show, I had all the artwork by that point. We'd shot a lot of it, had little sections of motion in it. So I put that up as my dip show, and I still didn't have a final cut. I didn't have a proper finished print, if you like. So when we finished, got the bit of paper, which nobody ever asked to see ever again. So then I thought, well, bloody hell, I've got to make a living now. so what do I do now? Well, I'm waiting for what I wanted to do was to be able to hike the print around and try and get work in the business, in the industry. But I didn't have anything at that point that I could show. So I started trying to hike around London to publishers and stuff like that, trying to get illustration work and book jackets and stuff like that. I started getting a bit. And then I bumped into one of my old tutors who was working for a publisher in the art department then. And she looked at my folio and said, well, it's all very well, but it's all you, isn't it? So all this style is your style. And I said, well, I don't know, how else can I present it? She said, go home and look at every possible style you can think of and find and stumble across and research and emulate it. Give us an example of your version of that style. Give us some examples. So that's what I did. I went and spent time, just producing as many different things as I could think of. It's kind of highly finished book jackets about paratroops and, all sorts of weird things, Shakespeare plays and all sorts of stuff like that. And I just built a folio of that kind of stuff. And so I hawked it around, and I got a reasonable amount of work. So, I could do a book jacket in about a week, I suppose, and I was getting about 30 quid for it, which to me, that was riches. That was amazing. So I could actually pay my rent, buy food, even buy clothes, run a car, so it was all looking all right. And then I got the print for the movie, and then I started trying to hike around, and my first attempt to try and get work was in central London, was for a guy whose name I can't remember, to my shame. He, at the time, he was a bigwig, bee's knees in designing title sequences, big movie title sequences. And he did lots of split screen stuff and all that sort of thing. And I thought, wow, I need to go and work for this guy. I can apply to be his assistant. And he basically laughed at me. He said, get away, go off and get some experience, go and do some grunt work and come back when you 3 or 4 years time. So I thought, okay, so that's where it is. So I applied around, answered magazine ads in audio visual and stuff like that, and finally got an interview out in West London for an offshoot of Macmillan's publishing. And this little outfit in Richmond, in West London, was doing things like 16mm film loops, like a 3-minute piece that was on a loop in a cassette. And so I went and applied for a job there, using the print that I had as my showreel, if you like. And I actually got offered the job. So, and that was on the basis of 3 days a week. And for that I got £18.12 for the three days a week, which again was fantastic. It was a reliable income every week. I didn't have to go hiking around London, so I'll still be able to do 4 days a week doing freelance work. So that's when I got used to the idea of just doing freelance really, and with that little bit of security for the £18, 12 and 6, which paid the rent and stuff like that. So that I did that for the next, well, getting on for a year, I suppose. So that's how that happened. I mean, I'm rambling on now. I'm sort of, one thing's rambling into another. So if you've got other questions, ask me those.
So how did that lead to the setting a company on your own then for yourself?
Well, while I was in Richmond, I thought, hang on a minute, everything's happening up in Soho. You know, this is a bit far out of the cool scene. You know, so I thought I'm gonna hand in my notice and I'm gonna go up to Soho and see if I can get a job. So I gave him my notice, and I was working with a young lady at the time who was in the art department, who said, listen, if you've got a couple of weeks before you start trying to get work up and down, could you do me a favor? My dad is really busy at the moment. He's overloaded, and he was a studio in Slough, and that was a studio called Pierce Studios. So I said, well, yeah, fine, anything. I'm happy to do that and extra dosh. So I went and did what was supposed to be a couple of weeks working for him, for Ly Pierce, who was her dad, and it kind of rolled on a bit, and he got busier and busier. Basically, he had far too much work coming through for the capacity, the capabilities of the studio. There was already another guy working as an assistant for him, and it turned out that the lady who employed me at Richmond had worked in her previous career, had worked for Ly Pierce as an assistant animator there. So he went on, and I asked somebody that I'd been at college with to come and give us a hand, and then I asked another guy who'd been in college with us to come and give us a hand, and in the end there were about 8 or 10 of us crammed into this little studio in Slough, and it all got a bit crazy really. I mean, we built, out of one of the spare bedrooms, we built a dark room and put a copy camera in there and processing units and stuff, and it just went on, you know, it just got busier and busier, and so before we knew it, there's a couple of years had gone by, and it was obviously overcrowded really. We couldn't carry on in that way at that pace. So as it happens, one of the clients at the time, who we used to do things like title sequences for and stuff like that, they said, well, we're actually retreating to the top floor of the building we're in, because we don't have enough need for the whole business, the whole building. How do you feel about taking half the floor or something like that, half the ground floor? Right? And so we said, fantastic. So we took half the ground floor, and on one side was 2 rostrum cameras of the corridor, and a dark room, and on the other side was a studio and a little office. I mean, I found myself stuck in a little office and didn't like it much because I felt very isolated. So knocked the hole through, you know, knocked into the main thing and combined the whole thing. And that went on like that for, well, I mean, we were up in that building for 13 years in the end, before we pulled out. So I was still working for Pierce Studios, if you like. I wasn't, although technically speaking, we were all freelance, really. I mean, as far as HMRC were concerned, there was one person on the PAYE, and that was the important thing. So as long, and as far as the bank was concerned, for overdraft facilities and stuff like that, there was somebody on PAYE, you know, a director. So we turned it into a limited company, and I was one of the directors. Ly and Susie, his wife, were directors, and Val, their daughter, was a director. So that's how that functioned. And the studio in Slough carried on functioning with Ly and Susie working there, and Val, who by now was my wife. So nothing like a bit of nepotism, you know, marrying. That carried on like that for 13 years, and most of the time we had 8 or 10 people working in that studio. I mean, it fluctuated, and we went through some pretty bad times when there was no work, and so I went to people like Alison Batchelor and people like that who were doing I mean, we got a load of work, things like the Count of Monte Cristo, and that sort of production where they had loads and loads of trace and paint work that needed doing. So I would go and collect boxes and boxes of trace drawings, animation drawings, and then we'd go and get them, farm them around everybody to get them traced and then painted and cleaned up and then sent back to them again. You know, so there was a kind of like a subcontract circuit going on where we were collecting, you know, raw animation, if you like, and turning it to finished artwork. So that kept us going for a bit. I mean, but there were other dodgy times, of course, you know. But generally speaking, we got busier and busier. I mean, one problem was when we first arrived in the new studio, I was trying to instigate a contract system, because up to that point, if you took on a job from a client, it's basically on a, yeah, great, we'll do that. And they're going, okay, thanks, we'll pay you something in the end. And it was a sort of a very loose gentleman's agreement, if you like, that was kind of just seemed to tick along. And here's me thinking, this isn't good enough. I think we need to have a little contract that people say, we've undertaken to do this, you've undertaken to pay us that. And, you know, this will be the sequence of events. We'll do a storyboard, and then you will okay that, and we'll do some colour roughs, and you'll okay that, and then we'll do the finished job, and you'll pay that. And both of us will sign, and that's all seemed to be like a sensible idea. Everybody hated it. The client, of course, absolutely hated it. They just, and it's so badly, in fact, that our main client at the time decided not to give us any more work because of that. So, you know, there we were in this new premises, you know, having set the rostrum cameras up and the darkroom up and everything, sitting there waiting for work, zilch. it just died a death because our main client. But then gradually we climbed back from that, got some new clients, and we never worked with them again. Sadly, it was a ridiculous situation. But the guy who ran that was he was a bit of a cavalier kind of character, and he just said, we've always worked together for, you know, and you've let me down, you've turned against me, and I'm going, hang on a minute, you know, all we're trying to do is to put this on a sort of business level, you know. Yeah, well, and they tended to treat us like an in-house design unit, if you like, in-house artwork unit.
Right.
But they didn't. They expected us to behave like that, but they didn't actually treat us like that. They didn't pay us a salary, for instance. You know, so we weren't in-house, but we were, if you like. I mean, it was a very strange situation. But anyway, it got better, and things improved over time. So yeah.
How did all this lead to the work with Hitchhiker's Guide?
Okay. That's all down to Kevin, really. It goes back to the new studio that we were in up in Hanwell, half the ground floor. The other half of the ground floor was used by the BBC, and they had cutting rooms mostly. It was mostly cutting rooms, and you could hear the sounds coming up the corridor, you know, because they all left the doors open, you know, all the time. So there's this cacophony of sound coming up the corridor all the time. And we just recently employed a young guy called Kevin Davies, who has later become a famous name in Hitchhiker's world. And he could hear something down the corridor that was familiar to him, and it was the sound of R2-D2. And so he thought, oh, I've got to go and check this out, because he was an absolute nut for anything sci-fi, Doctor Who, you know, Blake Seven, Hitchhikers, and Star Wars, of course. So he sort of went down there and kind of peered in the door, and sort of he was noticed by the two people in there. One was an editor, and the other guy was Alan Bell, who was a BBC producer. And he, at that time, was producing a program called Jim Will Fix It. Now, the Jim in that calculation has kind of become a notorious name in the future times. But at the time, it was a very popular program, and kids loved it because they got a chance to do something exciting. And on this particular one, the kid was going to be meeting R2-D2, and they had the footage, and they were putting the program together. And so Kevin got talking to him, and he was obviously very enthusiastic, and said, "Well, what's your next project?" And Alan said, Well, we've got this strange thing coming up called Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and he said I'm supposed to be producing it. I said I haven't got a clue what to do with it because it's really weird. It's a really odd thing. I can't just do a straight drama. So Kevin said, so what's the problem? He said, well, it's got all this kind of graphics and stuff in it. It's got simulations of this book. It's an electronic device. Kevin said, well, maybe we could help. He said, maybe we could supply something. Come and have a look at our showroom, you see. So he was actually the real salesman at this point, and it was a brilliant job. I knew nothing about this. This was all happening down the corridor. So a short while later, Kevin brought Alan Bell into the studio and said, this is Alan Bell. This is, could we show Alan the showreel? So I went, sure. So upstairs we went and ran the showreel for him, and Alan went, I think there's some stuff in there that could work. Maybe you can do. Maybe I'll come back again. He said, I'll come back in about a week's time, and we'll talk to BBC Graphics in the meantime and stuff, and see what the chances are. So I thought, okay, yeah, a week's time, 2 weeks time, maybe. I doubt whether we'll see Alan again. He'd go away. Yeah. So I carried on work. We all carried on working in the studio on other projects that we were on, and lo and behold, a week later, Alan turned up with Douglas Adams, and can we have a look at the showreel again? So they had another look at the showreel, and Douglas Adams went, do you know what? I think there are bits in there that could work. Can we get them to do a test piece? And Alan said, well, I'll talk to BBC Graphics, whether they're happy with that, and then yeah, maybe. So we would eventually, I say eventually, only in the space of a couple of weeks, really. BBC Graphics were very suspicious. They were convinced that it couldn't be done. Basically, they'd been asked to have a look at it themselves, and they'd said, well, the new internal computer graphics department had said, no, this is just too much work here. You need something much more sophisticated than is available, and it would take far too long. It would be too expensive, and all this stuff. So they went, okay, well, do a test piece and let's see what we can do. And the test piece they gave us was the first half of the Babelfish sequence. So we, in the space of, I suppose, must have been 2 or 3 months, possibly, put together a sample piece, which was eventually used as the first half of the Babelfish graphics. And so when they saw it, they went, yes, right, done, you're on. So do the second half and we'll carry on. So you start coming to these production meetings, and so it went on, and that's how it kicked off, really. And the rest of it, all the work for the 6 episodes went through. Once it kicked off, I think we spent something like 3 months doing the whole lot. It turned out to be about 45 minutes worth of running time. Yeah. Of graphics only, spread over the 6 episodes, and a lot of stuff on things like the Heart of Gold screens, which was in the control room with lots of stuff on the screens and stuff like that, and bits of things like Trillion with numbers going round her head and all that sort of stuff, and Deep Thought with front projections on smoke in front of Deep Thought and all that kind of stuff. So there's all those little bits as well going, trundling alongside the main stream of the episodes. But literally they were taking, 16mm rush prints and telecine, because there was no time to muck about and go back for a second hit or anything like that. They were basically going, right, that's fine, stick it on the telecine machine, get it on the video, right, that's it. So that's how it worked.
So how did the workflow actually work then? Did you get sound clips and things like that to work from?
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly how it worked. We got, first of all, got the script, and with the voiceover, and a separate 16mm mag track, which was just a 16mm magnetic piece of film with an audio recorded on it, and we'd run it through. Mostly me running it through a PicSync, which was just a device where you could put several streams of picture with an audio track, so that you could listen to that. So I just used the audio track and just marked up with the China graph on it where the words were. I mean, literally, that's all I did was just mark up the words on the voice, and then sat down transferred that onto a dope sheet, which is, if I'd been prepared, I could have shown you some examples, but I'm sure everyone will understand that. It's basically it's a sheet with loads of columns which are separate layers of material, if you like, and how the frame numbers. And what would happen, whether it be a mix or a zoom or a pan or whatever, that would be marked up on these. So every line represented a frame of film. So I put words down the left-hand side, to sort of letter by letter, actually down. So we figured out how long things would have to take to cover that bit. And then we did storyboards, very scrappy storyboards. No one ever really looked at the storyboards and said, yes, that'll be all right, because there wasn't time for that. It was basically so that we understood what we were trying to aim to do. It was just a series of storyboard frames from a pad, and mostly just scribble pencil and bits of thin pen written over the top with the voice underneath and saying, Betty will do this bit, Rod will do that bit, Kevin will do the trace and paint on that, and so on. And that's how it went on. And so basically, once we'd done the storyboard, we do an overall layout for the scene, with a screen size field area thing. It was called a field chart, and so we'd lay out camera setup and all that kind of stuff, and then start animating, basically. So we had to do as much as possible that didn't require loads of trace and paint, because there wasn't the budget all the time to do that. So we had to try and do as much as possible under camera, if possible. So devised this kind of method of running text in, because we wanted to try and keep it feeling busy. But the only way you could feel it busy was literally to fill it with action, but you didn't have the resources all the time to fill it with action. So what we did was run in bits of text at the bottom, so with a bright front end to try and make it feel electronic, and everything was backlit. We did, strangely, this takes me back, we did actually start out on that, going back to the first trial piece of the Babelfish. It did start out being top lit and looking much more cartoony, sort of Disney conventional animation type of feel to it, top lit. And for one thing, it was going to be horrendously time consuming to try and keep all that clean with top lighting and several layers of cell. So there was a decision there to change that, but also it didn't look very computery. So, and that was brought up by the BBC graphics liaison guy, who was called Doug Bird, his name was. And he said, surely computers are supposed to be kind of clunky and square, and you don't get all these rounded edges. And my comeback on that was, well, if the straight lines are short enough, and there's a lot of them, then you get a curve. So we compromised between that and simplified it right down, made it much more stylized, much more graphic, if you like. And with the backlighting as well. The backlighting, of course, meant that you had to do multiple exposures, because sometimes it was too complicated to cut lighting gels to fit different elements of the image. So it was easier to do a mask and do a complete exposure run with one color. Go back and do another exposure run with another. You had to, of course, make pretty sure your counters were in, where you had pretty good track of your frame count, so that things, once you, for the scenes, the action that you'd already exposed, with the new exposure was going to fit in properly with all of that. So, I mean, the most we did on anything was about 16 exposure runs for one movie film. So that was a whole different way of approaching stuff that we hadn't really done before. I mean, we'd done it on a small level, like 2 or 3 exposure runs, but not to that extent. But touch wood, it actually worked out. So where was I? Next question, probably.
Were there any scenes that you had to redo or change a lot, did any sort of not come off as well as you expected the first time round?
I can't think of any. The closest I can come to that is we came to a bit of a brick wall on the money stuff. The sort of size of a planet, bits of currency, and there was one bit that was well, what it ended up as was a load of zeros, with some of the zeros making silly thing, sticking stuff like that. And that was Douglas's idea, because we were kind of stuck with what to do for that, because from the script it wasn't particularly obvious what you could fill the screen with while that was going on. And so we asked him to come and brainstorm, if you like, and just say how he saw it. And he could see the problem, and he thought of it as an intellectual thing, if you like. I mean, so he hadn't actually thought how you would back it up with some sort of visual. So there he is. We had a spare space in the middle of the studio between all the desks, which allowed you to walk up and down. Most of us just used it to go and make coffee and stuff like that, but Douglas was going up and down, turning around again. And then he'd go, do you know what? I know what you need to do. You should just have a load of zeros that come in, and every now and again, one of those zeros goes blah, blah, blah. And in the end, that's exactly what we did. And it got us out of the hole. But that's the nearest I don't remember anything being rejected or having to be rethought completely. I don't think there was the time, to be honest.
Yeah.
The timescales were so tight. I mean, we'd never been able to produce 45 minutes worth of screen time in 3 months before. I mean, for the size of team that we were, it was pretty much unheard of. I mean, we just would have, if a client had come and told us that that's what they needed, we would have said, "Oh, steady on." We might have to employ a lot more people or something. Or get bigger studios. But no, there wasn't the time for it. It just seemed to roll on, and you got carried along on the flow, really. So, I can't say I remember. I'll have to contact Kevin, and I'll come back to you on that one, because he's probably got a much better memory about the machinations of, because he very often disappeared from the studio. And you'd find out later that he'd been up to a studio shoot or something, and he'd been in the control room chatting to Alan Bell and people like that. So sometimes the only news we got was from Kevin, second or third hand, from what was going on up there, which was kind of useful, but it was a bit out of my control, really, because it's sort of, well, I didn't care. I was too busy worrying about getting the next episode out. But we did need Kevin to do stuff occasionally. so and he did things like he did the whole of the poetry sequence, for instance, on the Grunthos the Flatulent and all that kind of stuff. So he designed the characters there and did the artwork for all that kind of stuff. And I think the only thing I contributed to the poetry sequence was a young woman with kind of bunches. I remember it was about the worst poetry in the world, that sort of stuff. And I can't remember her name anyway, but that was the only bit of visual I contributed towards that particular sequence. So it was all very much a mix and match. It was just whoever could do stuff at the time, really. I mean, I was doing animation drawings for things like the dolphins, and for that, I rigged up a projection unit underneath the light box, which was an 8mm cine projector, which had a single frame facility on it, and so with some aluminium angle things and some G clamps and stuff, rigged it up to project up onto the back of the light box the screen, the glass on the light bulb, so I could trace off dolphins and water and stuff like that. But then that would then go to various people to trace, and a load of it was traced and painted by my wife Val, who was in a different location. I mean, at that time, she was working down at the Slough studio with her parents. And sometimes I believe my daughter, who was probably, I can't think how old at the time, probably quite young, actually did some black painting on the, sort of some of the open areas that needed to be masked out, that sort of thing. So it was very much whoever had a free moment would lean into the work, So
Yeah.
it's kind of mad, but it was probably the most enjoyable thing we ever did, I think, probably.
Well, I remember seeing the TV series, and I was blown away by it. I think what I liked about the animations was it was it looked like it was hardwired onto a console rather than a computer screen, if you see what I mean. It matched the fact it was an handheld device before there were such things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, having seen the way they did that, I mean, they were back projecting 16mm rushes via a mirror system onto the screen of the book. So when they were moving the book around, there was a rig that was kind of following that around out of camera view, of course. But I mean, so it was quite clever stuff for that time. It was you couldn't, for instance, there was no way that you could plot it with a corner penning device to sort of keep a I don't know, a digital image, because I mean that wasn't there. It just wasn't. I mean, strangely, we had decided before this ever happened that what we needed as the next step was to get a computer. Because over in the corner was one of my mates who was working, been there for ages, and all I could hear from him every now and again was, "What we need is a computer to do this bit." So finally, I said to him, "Go, you research it and come up with a recommendation of what is available, what could we use." So he did. It took him a while, but we came before this all arose with Alan Bell and everything. We had actually decided on a computer, and we'd been to see the people who developed the software in Cambridge. There were a bunch of 20-story brains who were working by the river in Cambridge. And we'd ordered it, and we were waiting for it to be installed. But we had to put it on hold because there was no way that we were ever going to be able to cope with the two together. I mean, and learn how to use it and all the rest of it. It was obviously going to be too big a task to do that, and we may never have been able to produce anything usable. We just didn't know. So we put it on hold, and it was only after Hitchhikers was finally delivered in complete that we then went, okay, we now resurrect the computer project and go and put that in place. And as it turned out, BBC were quite happy about that because they had the notion that there was going to be a second series. So they went, okay, well, if you can hack it to get that working for the second series. And we were thinking, fantastic, they might pay a little bit of the cost of doing this, And then at the last minute, Douglas decided to go to Hollywood, and the second series never happened. It left us in a deep hole, I have to say. But in the end, it worked out. But at that moment, it wasn't a great moment, I have to say. It was kind of a silent scream. Anyway.
But didn't that lead to work on Terrahawks?
Terrahawks was okay. It's a little bit of a slightly sticky one. Kevin was very keen. He knew. Oh God, what's his name? The guy who was a Terrahawks bloke.
Gerry Anderson.
Gerry Anderson. He knew Gerry Anderson from being a follower, a fan for a long time of Thunderbirds and stuff like that. And he came pleading. At the time, we were absolutely overloaded with work. And Kevin came and said, please, can we do this job? And I said, well, Kevin, we can't promise the client that we can produce it in the time they want because we've got too much work at the moment. So either we employ other people to do it, who we don't know and we can't control very well. He said, I'll do everything. He said. I went, what, are you going to promise me that you'll take it on underneath your own steam, and you'll liaise with the customer and you'll do it all? He was so smitten with the idea that he promised to do it. Anyway, as it turned out, it got more and more difficult. There were other problems that cropped up during it, and the time was running out. So we had to had to have some awkward dealings with Gerry Anderson. I found him very difficult because I had to then take over because I was ultimately responsible for delivering the product, and we had too much else on, so I was finding it really difficult. But Gerry and I didn't really hit it off very well. I was not a smitten fan like Kevin, so he couldn't do to me what he did to Kevin.
Yeah,
he was quite. Gerry was quite aggressive. I felt he was quite domineering, and he thought he could beat you into it. I wouldn't be saying this stuff if Gerry was still around, you know. So
yeah, I know somebody else that's worked with him, and I know he can be quite controlling, can't he?
Yeah. I don't mean it to be detrimental to Kevin either, because he found himself in a difficult place because there was so much work going on, and he was trying to do the computer stuff as well. So we started getting other people in the studio involved, having to put the work they were doing slightly to one side so that we could actually produce and then come back to the other work. So it all got a little bit haywire. But I mean, a product was delivered in the end, which was fine, and Kevin did a very good job on the game which ran through it. You know, there was a thing with buildings coming up at you and a craft in the foreground. It was a reproduction of a video game, if you like, and you blew up the top of a building so that you could fly past it and all that kind of stuff. And that actually, in the end, I thought worked very well. But it was so stressed to try and get that stuff done. We had to pull in so many other resources to try and get it done in time, that I mean, it did in the end. To be honest, I at the end of that, I felt so beaten, if you like, that it was the beginning of me thinking that I wasn't sure I could carry on running the studio.
Right.
So I suppose I could carry on that thread. That shortly after that time, we were faced with a situation where the rent on our portion of the building was going to double, and I mean, by doubling it, it was already kind of hefty, but it was going to double, and I just thought, well, we can't just stagnate. We've got to move forward in some way or another, or sideways or backwards or something. You can't just sit here and just keep paying extra rent. And like all businesses, you need to feel like there's some momentum going on, there's some travel going on, you're going somewhere. And I sort of weighed up the options and thought, well, okay, the alternatives are to go into West End, get a premises up there, which would have been pretty hefty anyway, but at least the potential of returns would have been probably better. The only problem with that would be, I mean, yes, okay, some of the clients we already had were in Soho, so it would have been quite convenient for everybody concerned if we were going to do that. But the thing that I've balked at was that, well, I'd already been doing this for 13 years and working 7 days a week, sometimes 3 days in a row. I was beginning to feel exhausted, and I just thought, well, if we go this other route and actually have to go bigger, more expensive, you know, kind of bigger jobs, all the rest of it, we probably need to train more people. I don't know that I'd be alive at the end of the first 5 years, you know. So I just thought, so what's important here? And the computer was becoming more and more part of the throughput. And the computer, once one person on the computer could turn out a lot more work than people at light boxes. It was of a particular style, of course, so you couldn't really at that point reproduce what you could do with full artwork. But it had a style that was driven by the technology, if you like. But it was possible to have a throughput that you could sustain a reasonable kind of level of turnover. So in the end, I decided I'd like to stay alive and I'd like to spend some time with my family. So we looked around for a space. I'm sitting in that space now. It's the same space that we moved into. And eventually found just one place in the whole area that had enough space to do what was needed. So I then said, okay, I'm closing down the studio, but we'll do an overlap of a year so that everyone there has a chance to take their own clients out of the stream of work.
Yeah.
Still use the space, carry on producing work for a year, their own work. Use the facilities of the studio, like the darkroom and the rostrum camera and stuff like that, and we'll have a really nominal rental rate that you can just pay for the use of a darkroom or rostrum or whatever. And so we run it like a kind of like a very cheap utilities company for a year, so that everyone has a chance to find their own other alternatives, if you like. And that's what happened for a year. And then my friend Dave from art school, who was still working with me, decided that he would keep the space, cut down like half the space, so he took half the space, and carried on with a couple of the people who had been working there, and carried on the studio for a while. I can't think how long he went on for, but maybe a year or two. So they carried on that work throughput that was already going through. And I started working from here, and in the corner behind me, I don't know if you can see the over there where the gun's pointing down, with the rostrum camera going up to the ceiling there. Yeah, the sort of RSJs set into the floor, so the rostrum was in there. Took up a quarter of this space, and then behind me over there, you can't see, but there's a door over there, which went into a dark room, which has a processing unit in it, and Repro Master, and behind that was the computer room, which was air conditioned. And in this space were a couple of light boxes, because we still did some conventional work, and the computer workstation, which was just over to my left here, and operated like that. So at one time, when we had a job that was actually for digital pictures that we'd done work for before, required a lot of artwork being done, because at that time the technology wasn't producing the lit full color kind of product. So we plotted everything out, and we had people in here tracing and painting. So the plans chest over there, which you probably can't see, but the top plans chest was pulled out, and a light box kind of angled up in the top of it with an angle point underneath it, and people sitting on chairs with the plans chest pulled out as a desk, so the top drawer was the desk. And it all worked for a while. We had about five of us working in here from time to time. But that very quickly tailed off, because more and more you could get a finished product that was fully lit and full color, so less and less need for artwork. So 1995, probably the last occasion I used a paintbrush to do anything, in proper job, if you like, professional job. So since then that's been all digital.
You've done a lot of work for companies like Airbus, haven't you, as well?
Yes, that was where the work came from. I mean, I did lots of simulations and stuff for the Airbus, because they had aircraft that they were trying to flog before they were flying. So they, as part of their little promotional productions, they needed to feel that you could illustrate what this aircraft did and how many seats it had and all that. So there was quite a lot of that, and actually it kind of culminated in a load of stuff for an aircraft called the A400M, which is in use now by the RAF and the military, and has been seen going in and out of Afghanistan, and it can land on short desert strips and stuff like that. So it was quite an advanced aircraft. Strangely, I've just had my mate Dave, who I've been talking about earlier, who looked at the computer stuff. He's just been staying for a couple of days, and we were talking about that aircraft. And he says that apparently it's been quite disappointing. It's not lived up to what was promised. I didn't know that at the time. We had a fictitious bloody aircraft, so we had to build it from plans and stuff, and try and fly it around the sky. So I mean, it was, so we pitched lots of cloud backgrounds and stuff, and tried to get the right angles and fly these things over. And it was all good stuff. I mean, I enjoyed it immensely. I mean, it wasn't in any way creative, if you like, in the sense of Hitchhikers,
Yeah.
or Max Headroom or something like that. You know, it was a plodding requirement for a practical output. You know, and that's what it was really. I mean, but still enjoyable, and it allowed me to carry on making a living. You know, so I can't think of anything that's been as much fun as well, both Hitchhikers and Max Headroom.